Late in this year's budget process, about 2 weeks after the state budget was due, Governor Kathy Hochul has thrown her weight behind a surcharge for second homes valued at $5 million and above. The governor has called this a quote unquote common sense measure and estimated it could raise $500 million a year in revenue for New York City, which is trying to navigate its way through a forthcoming budget deficit. But the measure is facing opposition from the Real Estate Board of New York, which argues it will hurt New York City's housing market and property values. For more on the group's opposition, we're joined by Martha Stark, who served as finance commissioner in the Big Apple during the Bloomberg administration. Thanks for making the time, Martha.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here with you and look forward to talking with you about this topic.
Same here. Well, on its face, this seems like a pretty narrow and basic proposal, which will hit a small percentage of property owners. But when the idea was gaining steam back in 2019, you argued that this proposal on the table at the time, different than what's maybe being considered, but the same ballpark, wasn't necessarily feasible or implementable. And we can get into the potential ramifications of what the governor is proposing in a second. But from a practical sense, what sort of concerns should people be thinking about when it comes to trying to implement something like this?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and you're right that this proposal has been around for a little while. And back in 2019, there was a proposal raised, and what ended up happening because the industry are big believers in New York, and certainly as am I, as a born and bred New Yorker, they wanted to do it in a most feasible way possible, and so they did it based on transfer taxes. So the mansion tax got increase so that they could raise the revenue that they needed. So about the pied-à-terre itself and what are some of the issues with it, the first is you're trying to find people for whom their place is not their primary residence. And very interesting ways to sort of think about that. I mean, generally speaking, you can ask, like, is this your primary residence? The way in New York, we would probably I would say guess at it is there are some exemptions that go just to people who have their primary residence here in New York. So that's one kind of issue. The second issue is that, as you know, because you've covered these issues before, New York City's property tax structure is not the easiest to navigate, and some of the numbers don't really makes sense, right? So if we're talking about homes, small homes, because they would also be subject if they're worth more than $5 million, those homes, the city of New York does value them based on sales price. But when it comes to co-ops and condos, they don't. So one of the issues is kind of determining which units are actually worth $5 million and whether or not you do that by looking at sales price and then saying, okay, now we think you're actually liable for this tax. That's, it's probably easier to do with condos. Co-ops are especially difficult because of the fact that you have shares in a building and the building itself pays the tax. And so how that's going to get distributed to some units that might be worth more than 5 million and others that aren't is also kind of a complicated feature of this particular tax. So for those reasons, absolutely folks are trying to sort of, one, get a handle on who would be liable, and two, then trying to figure out how it gets implemented in a way that's both fair and transparent and clear to those who actually owe it.
Yeah, the governor's office has not put out a lot of details to date on this proposal, but has estimated that about 13,000 second homes would be covered by this proposal. And some of the reporting has suggested that if this was to be implemented successfully, the governor and state legislature would have to come up with maybe a new mechanism for determining a home's actual worth as opposed to maybe its assessed value that would often be far lower than what it could achieve on the market. How complicated is something like that if we are talking about, say, 13,000 homes versus maybe the broader scope of pied-à-terres in New York City, which, according to some numbers analyzed by Gothamist, was about 59,000 a few years ago?
Yeah, so I think your question is a really good one because some of it is where are the sources of all these numbers? If I remember correctly, Gothamist took their numbers from basically the Census Housing and Vacancy Survey, which lists basically properties that are for seasonal use or something kind of like
Hmm.
that. I think that's what Gothamist did. I think the 13,000 number is coming from the American Community Survey, which also talks about vacant units. And so it is interesting how these numbers are being kind of shared because it's hard to tease out whether or not those numbers are actually accurate. A couple of reports that have been done since 2019. The IBO did a report suggesting that the number of units were lower. Actually, Controller Brad Lander did a report suggesting that the numbers were much lower when you kind of dig into who would actually be liable for this tax. And so we certainly think the 13,000 unit number is pretty high in the scheme of things. And as you noted at the top of your question, the details are not yet forthcoming about who, and then if who, then how much. Like there's just not any real transparent details. So one of the things that we've been looking at is a piece of legislation that's been introduced kind of almost every year since 2019. And there the threshold was an assessed value, as you note, of about 300,000. And one of the things that we've found in our analysis is if you take a $300,000 assessed value, it could affect a home that's as low as $1.8 million in price to one that's as high as 8.9 million, right? So the variation is so huge that relying on, the assessed value alone, and then whatever kind of multiplier one might add, it makes it really a pretty complicated thing to do. Last thing I'll say about it is that if you're going to somehow not use assessed value, it seems you should give someone a chance to challenge that. And so you're going to have to build an infrastructure as well. Maybe it's using the existing New York City Tax Commission to say, well, we took your property and we think it's 5 million, even though the assessed value is X, Y, and Z. So sort of thinking through all of those pieces is going to be important as they come up with whatever the plan is.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you for listeners just joining us. We're speaking about a proposal in plan in Albany to impose a surcharge for second homes valued at $5 million and above in New York City. And our guest is Martha Stark, who served as finance commissioner in New York City during the Bloomberg administration. Well, putting aside then the feasibility of something like this, let's talk about the potential ramifications or maybe the unintended consequences. And the influential Real Estate Board of New York has predicted this surcharge could hinder development and drive wealthy investors to other cities. On the former point, as it pertains to development, why would it hinder development as opposed to just shift maybe the type of development that's happening in New York City so that there's more focus on homes less than $5 million or for homes that people actually want to live in all year round?
Yeah, so I think, I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to talking about what factors go into sort of development. I mean, I do think, your point's well taken. It will shift the market in the future, but I do think there are some development projects that are in the works right now. Those development projects in the works right now have been financed with some assumptions underlying what's going to get built, right? And so I do think that those that are in development right now might certainly, it might have a negative effect on their ability to finance those things because they already have existing, sort of rules and covenants in those loan documents. As for what it would do in the future, I mean, I think that, development, as I understand it, is pretty complicated and the finances. So would it lead them to build, sort of things that sell for less than 5 million? I don't know. I can't really speak to that. But I do think that certainly taxes are a significantly important part of everybody's formula. It certainly would be for you and me in terms of our home as well, and the purchase price that we'd be able to bear if the taxes are of a certain amount.
Yeah, and what we understand from the governor's proposal is that the tax or surcharge, however they want to bill it, would likely involve different rates across multiple brackets. And when I think about my own life, there are certain surcharges that I don't blink at. And I have to imagine that's the same calculation for people who might be buying a house at $5 million dollars or $238 million dollars. So is it possible we could be finding a sweet spot with this type of surcharge where the consumer choices aren't going to be impacted and New York City could potentially get the $500 million dollars in anticipated revenue?
So I think, look, the industry is, committed to New York City, and I'm sure that they're going to want to be very helpful in recognizing both that the city has a fiscal kind of crisis and is in need of help. And I think the point that you made is a really good one. The question is, what's the sweet spot that, gets some of the revenue that's expected, but that doesn't really do harm? And I think that's the thing that we'll be able to better assess when we know what's the proposal, and we don't know that yet. And so what we do know is what the revenue target is. It's 500 million plus, but we don't know what the proposal is, and it's harder to assess it under those kind of circumstances for sure.
Is New York sort of uniquely situated to impose this type of surcharge? Because where there are other industries, for example, that might move to another state because it's cheaper, if you're looking to plant like $300 million dollars into a home, you can't necessarily, find one in, I don't know, Rhode Island, but maybe you can. So is this one of those cases where we might scare away people, or are there just limited options for people who are looking to plant a lot of money into property? And so New York City doesn't necessarily need to be worried about losing that type of investment.
Well, I mean, I do think that I think there was a story today about the number of New York City residents that have left over the course of the last couple of years. So I
Oh,
do
sure. But I
think
mean, I'm
that,
talking about those
you know,
people who are looking to buy a property because they're looking to plant money, for example, in
ah,
a major property. And I guess, upstate New York doesn't necessarily have a lot of those same options as maybe only New York City might.
well, I think that, again, what's important to remember is at that level, the money that you're spending is discretionary. And so the question is, if you feel like you're in an environment that's hostile to you, do you want to invest in
Hmm.
that particular place? So I do think that even though you're right, like where else would you buy a $238 million property? Well, I don't know, maybe a beachfront, maybe in the Hamptons. I don't really know where, but I'm just saying it's discretionary money. And to the extent that you have choices to make, you also would consider and factor in what are the taxes, and more importantly, kind of what's the environment in which I'm purchasing something.
Well, lastly, if this is imposed and it does have a detrimental impact on the buying practices of people who are looking for very expensive homes, are there existing revenue streams that this could potentially hurt for New York City? I mean, are there ways in which these types of purchases are already very important to the bottom line of the city?
It's a great question. So, definitely, what's most sensitive to this would be our transfer tax revenues, because the transfer tax is imposed at the time of purchase. And then also, we have a mansion tax that's on top of that. And so, one of the things that we certainly want to make sure is considered in the amounts that everyone's thinking about is the possibility that you're going to have to hedge against losing some revenues in other areas. So again, I think that, the simplest way to think about it is that if you and I are going out to buy a house and we know that we can only spend $3,000 a month on that house, that 3,000 has to pay our property taxes as well as our mortgage, and the like. And if that means a sales price that's lower, that's what we're going to pay. And I think that same thing works actually at the high end of the market too. And so the prices may come down. If the prices come down, it does have an effect on your transfer tax revenue, which the city is quite sensitive to. And I wouldn't want to, David, leave this conversation without talking about the fact that the city's property tax
Sure.
structure is in dire need of improvement, and that there are some opportunities to do that that would at least make the base seem a lot fairer than it is. And that's something that we should be, as you know, I've been working on this for a long time, but it's something that we should also be considering in the mix. What you don't want is the property tax structure limiting your ability also to do this in a way that's as fair as possible and transparent as possible.
Yeah, comprehensive property tax reform is definitely a conversation that New York City needs to have. And unfortunately, we don't have time for that one right now. But
Invite me back.
Sure. Well, we've been speaking with Martha Stark. She served as finance commissioner for the Bloomberg administration in New York City. Martha, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Have a great day.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.